Tonight, we're privileged to have Clark Twitty with us sharing his insights and research, shedding light on the remarkable journey of the Outer Banks and the visionary individuals who have shaped its destiny. In addition to Clark Twitty's expertise, we are honored to have a distinguished panel of individuals who have played instrumental roles in the growth and development of the Outer Banks. Let me introduce them to you. Charles Evans. Charles is the former mayor of Nags Head, former NC state legislator. Charles has dedicated his life to public service and has been a key figure in shaping the community as we know it today. John Harris. John is the founder and president of Kitty Hawk Kites. John's entrepreneurial spirit and love for adventure have contributed to the thriving visitor economy on the Outer Banks. Tess Judge. Tess is a local businesswoman and community leader. Tess's passion for community engagement and entrepreneurship has made a significant impact on the growth and vitality of the Outer Banks. Chris Salwin. Chris is president and CEO of the Outer Banks Community Foundation. Chris's leadership in the nonprofit sector has brought about positive change and supported the community's well-being. Their collective expertise and perspectives will provide invaluable insights as we explore the stories and themes presented in Outer Banks Visionaries. Once again, we welcome you here tonight. Great crowd, thank you so much for coming. Tonight promises to be a truly enriching experience as we celebrate the spirit and visionaries of the Outer Banks. Thank you to Clark Twitty and all of our panelists for sharing their knowledge and passion with us. Enjoy the event, and thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, can everybody hear me? Okay, I do better on my feet. Number one, thank you everybody for coming. And it goes without saying that my favorite book signing event in the history of the Outer Banks was the one that David McCullough did at Duck Woods. And if you weren't there, David McCullough sang. So in a moment of trying to read all of our minds, yes, I am no David McCullough, but at least we have Tess Judge. So, yeah. So we're going to have some fun tonight. And I want to say thank you. I want to say thank you to the Don and Catherine Bryan Cultural Series. I'll digress just for a second. Don Bryan is famous for being the mayor, famous for being an artist. He was a combat pilot in multiple wars. When he was 18 in 1942, he was a tail gunner in what was called a B-17 Flying Fortress. And he completed 25 missions. And you may say, why the significance of 25 missions? And the answer to that is because 75% of bomber crews in the 8th Air Force did not live to see 25 missions. They were killed, captured, or wounded. And Don Bryan went anyway. And when I hear Don Bryan's name, I ask myself, where do we find such people? So imagine if Don Bryan would have been in that other category, where would we be? And I don't say that to digress, but I wanted to do a hat tip to Don Bryan and Catherine. I want to do a hat tip to the North Carolina Aquarium. There's no better venue in the state of North Carolina tonight. I want to give a shout out, yes, the aquarium. If someone's here. Vine and Board did the catering, Devin Frazier on guitar. So I want to get my thank yous correct. So this is a book about them. When the bridge reopened in what was just about 3 years ago, the Outer Banks, I believe, came to a crossroads. And the question became, and all of us wrestle with it every day, where do we go from here? And at what place have we arrived, and what kind of future do we now have? And I see heads nodding up and down. We all ask that question. And I believe the way to understand how we got where we are is to understand the people who built it. So 3 of the people who are up here tonight. I'm going to stop talking. We're going to let them talk. I've followed around for years, and I write down what they say. So I have limitless admiration for the folks who are going to talk, because I believe entrepreneur, it turns out, is a French word, and it means to build something from nothing. They built something from nothing. and it's the Outer Banks we all inherit. And there are some other folks in the room. When you write a book about visionaries, it's easy to figure out who you include. It's harder to figure out what you don't have time for. Charles Hardy, I see you in the room. There's lots of other folks in the room. Taylor Sugg, who wrote the foreword, is here tonight as well. Thank you, Taylor. Having said all that, let's get to why you came. So I thought what we would do is just have a conversation and ask some people to tell us, are these stories true? Does anybody in the room remember the Outer Banks Casino? You ever wonder what happened to the Outer Banks Casino? In 1974, a young man named John Harris was hanging out in the old Outer Banks Casino, and he had gone around the Outer Banks and told the few bankers who were here, Ray White, I see you back over here, and said, I want to start a hang gliding company. And people said, you're crazy, it will never work. John, did I get that story correct?
Close.
Okay. John, how did you build Kitty Hawk kites?
Hard. Is this on, I guess?
Can everybody hear John? Let's get this sound. We're recording this tonight, and we're going to donate it to the Outer Banks History Center. So let's pause for a moment and get the audio right so that one day people we have never met will watch this video and they'll know what happened. There he goes. Oh, Sam Walker.
Thank you, Sam. So Ray White knew we were crazy, and Stan White, fortunately, listened a little bit, and a lot. Stan was terrific through our start up and through building. And so the story is, let's see, 73, we came down in August 73, and I was living in Winston-Salem at the time, and Ralph Buxton and I saw Hang Glider in the Winston-Salem Journal. That was kind of it for me. I was an engineer in Winston-Salem working for Western Electric and AT&T, and I was so excited about the sport of hang gliding, and so we came down and we ran up and down the sand dunes with this glider in 1973 until we figured out how to fly it. So we basically taught ourselves how to fly on Jockey's Ridge, and it was such an incredible experience. It was even better than I imagined. I'd seen the picture and, just it hit every nerve that I had. But once we flew, it was a better experience than I had imagined. So I couldn't wait to share it with everyone. And from that point on, we started talking about how we could share it. And Ralph and I worked our way through college together. That's how I knew Ralph. And we had always talked about starting a small engineering company someday. But that kind of went out the window, and we got into hang gliding, and I went into one realtor's office in Kitty Hawk when I came into town in the fall of '73 looking for a location, and I told them I wanted to open a hang gliding school and service center and sales center, and they laughed me right out of the office. And when I told them what I wanted to do. And then I walked into Outer Banks Realty at the time, which is where Stan was in Nags Head, and he listened to me, and he didn't laugh at me, and he said, I just heard that somebody bought the casino, and they may not be using the old garage at the casino. So that was the lead that we needed. And the lease for the garage worked out, and we went on there. The garage had an outhouse, so we were covered. For five years, we operated out of that warehouse until we were able to prove to Ray White that we were going to survive. And after 5 years, Ray and Chris Payne made us our first loan from Planters Bank. So.
And if you can't see, Ray White is right back over there. John, the story I heard, when Ray White, this is another, is this true? When Ray White came to see you, the garage did not have plumbing, and there was an outhouse, and you said, Ray, come around this side and we'll show you the outhouse. And he said, young man, I don't need to see that. And now, all these years later, and we'll get to that, but that was the start of Kitty Hawk Kites and what I think is arguably the business that defines the Outer Banks. And that's how it started.
That's the start of Kitty Hawk Kites in March 1974.
Hey, John, how much was your rent there in that garage?
$300 a month.
I thought it was a little less.
Mr. Evans, Mr. Charles Evans.
That brings back a lot of...
Let's make sure we get it right.
Hello? There it is. That brings back a lot of memories, John. I was in the process in 1973 of relocating back to Manteo after finishing law school, and I ended up living in Nags Head, and to make a long story short, ended up deciding to run for the Nags Head Town Board of Commissioners, which I had no idea that I would do at that point in time, but I did. And so I was elected to the town board in 1973 when you were first coming, and I remember that very well. And I was one of the 5 commissioners in the town of Nags Head, where, of course, the casino is located. And Ray White was our local banker and did a lot for this community, Ray, and thank you for all of that so much. And Stan and your involvement in getting John started was terrific. And we're still here today. So.
All right, let me jump in here. I'm going to interject if I can. This is another is this story true moment. So in 1973, Carolista Baum sits in front of the bulldozer.
Yes.
And the bulldozer operator goes home and says, well, I'm not going to run her over. And when he leaves, Carolista Baum takes the distributor cap. And John Harris says Carolista gets a lot of very justified credit. But there were other folks, Charles Evans, who protected Jockey's Ridge. Charles, if we somehow would have walked over a dune in 1974 and said, do you know you're protecting what is today arguably North Carolina's most popular state park and one of the most popular attractions on the East Coast, what would you have said to us?
I think we would not have, I certainly did not realize that it would grow into that. It was certainly something that was very significant to all of us that grew up here, and our visitors, of course, as well. I remember in the days when we could drive Jeeps up on Jockey's Ridge. That was a long time ago. But it was quite an event when something that we have taken for granted forever, living here, and those that came to visit, we just took it for granted that it was going to be there. But suddenly, people, owners of the property, which they had the right to do, started developing plans to develop Jockey's Ridge. And we could not imagine not having it. And it, of course, created quite a bit of emotion and commotion in the town of Nags Head and the whole area, actually. So we were all very much interested in preserving it for future generations. And the fact that it turns out to be the most visited state park in North Carolina is wonderful. And we are so fortunate to have it.
Go ahead, John.
And Charles, as I recall, on the board with you for Friends of Jockey's Ridge or Save Our Sand Dunes, I can't remember now which people to preserve Jockey's Ridge, was Marlene Roberts right here.
Yeah,
and
Marlene.
Eddie Green, George Crocker, I believe. Who else was on that board then? Carolista and Walter Baum.
And Walter, her husband.
Yep.
I forget who else, but
And Charles's uncle, Percy Meekins.
not my uncle,
Not your uncle.
no relation,
No relation.
just a very dear family friend.
Okay, I thought he was your uncle.
My father, they were best friends.
Anyway, he owned most of Jockey's Ridge at the time,
That is correct.
and he gave us permission on a handshake to teach hang gliding there. So then a year later, he sold it to the state.
Clark, I know you appreciate that, but it was something that we all wanted to do, but we, of course, wanted whoever owned it to be paid, the fair market value of the property. But it was quite a commotion there for a few months. But it all worked out very well, and of course, it's been a great tribute and a great part of our town and area, the Outer Banks.
Yes. Thank you all for your leadership at that time and the resource that you preserved.
We miss David Stitt and Carl Nunemaker.
David Stick, Carl Nunemaker.
They were all on people.
Yes, Carl was very much involved.
Yeah, Carl was mayor. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Marlene.
So Tess, I'm coming your way. David McCullough wrote a book called 1776, in which he put a lot of the context around the American Revolution into one year because for some reason, so many of the things that brought forth the revolution happened in one year. And I read that book and said, I think our equivalent to that on the Outer Banks is 1986. Corolla Light was started, Dick Brindley. Bob Oakes, who couldn't be here tonight, we'll talk about Bob, started the villages of Nag's Head, the Dare Center, the Outer Banks Mall. Many of you remember that. In 1985, there was a lady with kids in school in Greensboro. And her husband said, I'm going to go down to the Outer Banks. And she said, well, I'll follow you after we get the kids out of school. Tess, you could have gone anywhere. Why did you come here?
Well, Clark, you pretty much nailed it.
You told me that story.
Yeah, well, and so, right, so I thought, okay, so he said, Outer Banks is where it's happening. We really need to go to the Outer Banks, and so I'm going to go down there, and then you can come down and take a look. So I did, okay? It was November, dreary, raining, and back in those days, after September, early October, all you gentlemen know, all the hotels closed, the restaurants closed. I'm taking a look and I'm thinking, he's having a midlife crisis. Something's not going right here. So anyhow, right, he knew way more than I did, right? But anyhow, so as it was, Warren got started down here with what was then the Wilbur Wright Hotel, Orville and Wilbur Wright, and then of course we added to that property as we went along. But yeah, it was pretty amazing. And when you think about the Outer Banks folks, and I sit here tonight in this beautiful, beautiful place, and I think of Senator Mark Bassnight. When we came, there was Jeanette's Pier, and many of you all know that, right? But it wasn't this beautiful, amazing that we have here that people come and visit. But for us to come in here tonight, and many of us come here for many events and see this beautiful space and this beautiful area, we are so blessed and so fortunate by that. But fast forward back, I hate to say Warren was right, but he was. Because he said, you haven't seen anything yet as to what's going to happen here on the Outer Banks. And you look over the years, folks, at, medical and the schools. Back in those days, we didn't have a hospital. We had our wonderful Dr. Holton, who's with us tonight. Many of you know Dr. Walter Holton here tonight. But then, to see what's happened, how our schools have been able to grow, our wonderful College of the Albemarle, we have Dean Sweeney here tonight.
to see what has happened with our hospital and the facilities. It's amazing. And this community can only do what it does because of all the people here. I see people out here tonight that outreach in this community has brought it to where it is. Clark, you've been a part of that. Everybody behind this table tonight out here. I see Linda White with Food for Thought, and you see people out here with the Outer Banks Relief Foundation. You see them here with the Outer Banks Community Foundation. You know, think about everything that's happened here and what this community has done, and it's just been amazing. And I'm glad Warren had that vision. I would never tell him he was right, but you were right.
And we'll talk more about Mark Bassnight in just a moment. This is another Is This True? Tess, at one time you and Jane Webster told me you would leave the hotel. Now let me say this again. You'd leave the hotel and you'd get in your car and you'd go down the beach road and you would not see another car until you got home.
Right.
That wasn't that long ago.
No. Clark, another quick story. So finally, I moved down here in 1989. You know, the kids were, everybody's in college, everything's good. So I was going back and forth. Warren was here. Do you all remember the snowstorm Christmas Eve of 1989? Do y'all remember that? Well, yeah. So I always go to church midnight Christmas Eve, right? So I was set to go to St. Andrews at midnight. And I looked at Warren about 7 o'clock. I said, we might want to leave early tonight to get to church. He said, Tess, you're not going anywhere tonight. I said, what do you mean? He said, I said, they'll plow the roads. He said, you're not going anywhere tonight. You better get your prayer book out. So there we go.
Chris Solon, let's get this right. The Outer Banks Community Foundation was founded about 40 years ago, and let's get those founders correct. Ray White, George Crocker, the Galleon Esplanade, Restaurant by George, also a great picker of talent, two of his early hires at the Restaurant by George, Mike Kelly, and a young waiter during his summers here named Bob Oakes. There we go. We got lots of different folks in the room here tonight. I won't embarrass anybody, but yep, there are a few folks here. George Crocker, Andy Griffith, David Stick, Eddie Green. Who am I forgetting?
Martin Kellogg.
Jack Adams, thank you.
And the illustrious Ray White.
And we need to say Ray twice. Chris, those gentlemen, and I asked Ray one time, I said, Ray, why did it take you guys so long to start the Community Foundation, 1982? And he said, well, you don't understand, do you? And I said, no, I don't. I was 6. And he said, we didn't have any money to share. And 1982 was the first year we ever had $1 or $2 to share, and we thought, well, we could put it in one pot. Maybe we can make a scholarship or something and send someone to school. And 40 years later, the Outer Banks community has $25 million in assets and gives away, over $100,000 of scholarships a year, over $100,000 in grant funding. What do you think those folks would have said if they could somehow magically be in this room and see what it had become?
I think they'd probably be pleased with how far the organization has come, but I think they'd also be pushing us as hard as ever. There's just so much growth that this place has experienced since, at least, when my family came down here in 1972, and I think the focus of your book starts with Jimmy Carter and goes into the 1980s, but the growth that this area has had has created this reservoir of charitable funds, but I think they would say it's just the beginning. The next 40 years will see the baby boomers transfer just this enormous amount of wealth to future generations. So I think that especially David Stick, and David Stick really was the person that really got things going. But I think he'd be pushing us to do even more. The need in our community is always one step ahead of the resources available to address those needs. So, the folks that I work with, we feel that every day. But I will say we've got a tremendous origin story, and this is something that Edward Green told me when I got the job I have now 2 years ago. He was the first person I called, and I had a chance to really get to know him when I was at Dare County Arts Council. It was a tremendous mentor, and I asked him, what his favorite part of the community foundation was, and he said it's that it has always and continues to attract the best and brightest minds of the Outer Banks business and civic community. And he was there at the beginning. He got a phone call from David Stick, who was, like Don Bryan, really a Renaissance man, historian, writer, civic leader. I think he was a county commissioner. I think he was there for the creation of Southern Shores, and just always an innovator, bringing new ideas to our area. And he called Edward, he called Andy Griffith, he called George Crocker, and he told them all the same thing. If I invite you to a meeting, and I don't tell you what it's about, but I tell you who else I'm inviting, will you come? And of course they all did, and Edward had the foresight to bring a cameraman. And if you look on our website, it's sort of our iconic image of how the organization was created. And in that same breath, they invited the best minds in law, Martin Kellogg, Jack Adams as an accountant, and Ray White as a financier. And they held a press conference, which, still the idea of a press conference on the Outer Banks seems kind of comical. But, people showed up. A lot of people showed up. I don't know if Bobby and Dolores Harrell are here, but Bobby told me that that was their first date. They went to the press conference. But the idea was in the air. There are a number of community foundations throughout the state of North Carolina who are celebrating their 40th anniversary, getting ready to celebrate it, just celebrated it. So there was something in the air. There was an Elizabeth City foundation that sort of had the same ethos that had folded, and David Stick was very curious about that. I talked to his son Mike this week, knowing that I would be here tonight, and he described his dad as incredibly curious but also restless, and we all knew him as an innovator. So it was his thought to bring this idea of a community foundation, a foundation that wasn't a private foundation, it wasn't a public foundation, wasn't a corporate foundation, but it was governed by and run by the community. And in the following 10 years, the folks who were involved split up into teams. There was a Kitty Hawk team, and there was a Nag's Head team, and they started with business people asking for contributions. And they made their first grants very soon after that, their first scholarship award. But like a lot of the folks in your book, I think that they were winging it, that no one was telling them how to do it. They just kind of did it. And around 2000, there was an offer made by the North Carolina Community Foundation for Outer Banks to become an affiliate of the North Carolina Community Foundation. And there are affiliates close to us. There's one in Currituck, and there's one in Beaufort and Hyde. And the answer from our board of directors was, hell no. We're independent, we're going to stay that way, and I think that it's really paid off. The growth of the organization and what we're able to accomplish is really because of the work of those 7 individuals.
And we'll talk more about them. John, we're coming your way, but let's put some context around John. Now, part of the problem is that our panelists are too daggone modest to tell you that the adversity they overcame, they would say that wasn't the case, and yet we know, and here's how we know. 1979, the second half of Jimmy Carter's administration, stagflation had been affecting the United States economy essentially since LBJ. And Jimmy Carter makes 2 key decisions that in effect, end his presidency. Number 1, appoints Paul Volcker, the Volcker shock. Paul Volcker is on record, I will skyrocket interest rates. Interest rates in 1979 were 21.5%. To which Taylor Sugg and I immediately said, well, John, we still have some of that money if you want some. And John said, we said, absolutely not. The other appointment Jimmy Carter made was Sandra Day O'Connor. to a D.C. judge that fleeted up her role in the Supreme Court. Probably ended his presidency. To Jimmy Carter's unending credit, he chose courage over re-election. Ronald Reagan is elected in 1986. The prime interest rate was well under half of that. It had gone to somewhere in the 8s and 9s. In 1986, John, you built the Connector, the big building we all know opposite Jockey's Ridge. But my question is, did you ever imagine your efforts and what it would be today? Or you can talk about anything else you'd like to talk about.
We knew that it would be better and would grow, and we knew the Outer Banks would grow, and we thought we would grow also. So we were always very positive on the Outer Banks, and still are. So a little bit of that story is that in '81, I think it was, when interest rates were 21%, we had the opportunity to buy the casino property. We had just built the first building with the tower on it in 1979, so we were still recovering from that debt. And then this property came available, it was in bankruptcy, and we knew that if we didn't move, we would never have another opportunity. So we did a loan for 20% on that property. Ralph was the financial guru. Fortunately, I didn't understand it at all. So we were able to work through it and hang on until we were able to develop the connection, as you said, in '86 and opened in '87, and that really propelled us forward. So, thank you.
Charles, same question. You won't say this, so I'm forced to. You have one of the most the most well-regarded biographies we've ever produced as a people and as a region. Did you ever see that happening? Did you ever look back and said, this is what I'm trying to achieve?
I have all my adult life have enjoyed helping other people, and I have really, that's what I've done. I've started practicing law, opened my law office in '73, became a member of the town board, and one of the people that recruited me was George Crocker, as a matter of fact. And Joe Hume, who was chairman of the planning board. You remember Joe Hume? John. And I think Fred Hill might have been the other one. I can't remember. But anyway, what has happened here is incredible. It is a story that people would find hard to believe. But here it is. It's happened. We have gone through it after all these years, and it is absolutely amazing. I don't know that there's anyone in this room that knows or knew Mark Basnight longer than I have. We grew up in the same neighborhood. I'm a little bit older than Mark was, but the Basnight family and my family were just a block or two away from each other, and we grew up together. And it is absolutely incredible to think what has taken place. And so much of it we owe to Mark Basnight for all that he did, his foresight, and so much that he did for so many people. And we are still realizing the benefits of that today, and we will for time to come.
Tess, let's talk about Senator Mark Basnight. I will promise I'll get us out of here on time tonight. So we've got about 20 minutes. Mark Basnight grows up in Manteo. How does a guy who grows up in Manteo, and Walter Davis said you need to get some newspaper subscriptions to find out what's going on in the world, because I fear you don't know. How does he become the longest tenured Senate pro tem in the history of North Carolina? And how does he build bridges in 1992 that link us to the world and 4-lane highways to Raleigh? How did that happen?
I'm glad you gave me that question, seriously. Such a gentleman, such a wonderful gentleman. But I remember the stories too. Many of us go, and some of you in here go to Daniel's Day, and you'll hear the story of when Mark was a young man and they wanted him to go to Raleigh, but he didn't want to wear any socks, right, to go to Raleigh. And you hear that story. But to me, Clark.
And not his shoes either.
Yeah, that's right. You know that story too, right, Charles? But you've got to love that. But I think, and John, you knew him well, and Chris, I think in my heart, the reason that Senator Bass Knight was so successful was he always wanted to look at the one reason we could do things and not the 10 reasons we couldn't. And he constantly was looking for how do we make it better. But folks, he did so much for Dare County in eastern North Carolina, but make no mistake, that gentleman worked for this entire state. He was about people, and I think, Clark, that being able to collaborate and to communicate with the folks that were his colleagues in Raleigh is why he was so successful. And if he were in here tonight, and he had ever seen you one time, he would simply look at you and he would call you by name. He'd say Linda, he'd say Fletcher, he'd say Marlene, he'd say Sandra. He would go around the room. He was uncanny in that, but he loved this community sun up to sundown. And I'll never forget when he was in Raleigh and the Lone Cedar caught fire. I will never forget that and how that gentleman handled that. He was incredible, and he cared about everybody. He cared about that child from the time they stepped on that school bus all the way till they got through college or through the community college. And that's what made him such a wonderful leader, in my opinion.
Chris, we're coming your way. Everybody in this room has a Mark Bass Knight story. I'll share but one. I chatted with a gentleman who will remain anonymous who said, when Mark first got elected, I wrote him an ugly letter because I disagreed with him. And I had an above-ground pool. And one Saturday afternoon, I was floating in my above-ground pool, and I turned over, and Mark Bass Knight's nose was over my pool. And he's like, you wrote me this letter, you get out of that pool. And he said, that's Mark Bass Knight. Chris, all these years later, we do all these things prosper. We have this unique connection of folks who not only could build a business, but build a market. The Wright brothers, I think, were famous not only for their achievements in aviation and technical things like that, they're also famous as entrepreneurs. And in many ways, the inheritors of the Wright brothers' legacy are sitting right here. Chris, what are your thoughts around that?
Well, just briefly, I wanted to echo what Tess said about Mark Bass Knight with a story that came to me just this week, completely coincidental to this event. But I had lunch with somebody who worked with him closely on his staff and talked about what he did for the university system. And you mentioned that it's not just our area, but the whole state. And he told me the story of a moment where the state of North Carolina was considering a $200 million bond to support and expand the UNC system. And I think maybe the word for him is courage. He went to Governor Hunt over and over and said, no, it should be $1 billion. And we have Western Carolina University, we have Elizabeth City State University, Fayetteville State, that are entirely free for most students. And that's a direct result of his courage in pushing the envelope. And you know, our university system is the envy of the country, and in large part because of his courage to make that happen. And I'm afraid I've forgotten your question.
That was a better answer to the question I had. Very briefly, I want to point out this picture, and you folks know better than I do. This is the bridge to Manio. This is Pirates Cove. This was the original Pirates Cove. You see the boats over here? This was long before that. That was when Senator Bass Knight, I believe, began to accede to his leadership position at the Senate Appropriations Committee. The roads were widened and the bridges were built in a fairly narrow period of time. And Charles, I know you'll correct me when I make a mistake. This picture right here is that guy right there. that beaming smile right there, who went to work for George Crocker, and there was a famous interview where George said, Mike made everybody feel like they were the most special person on earth. My mother is in the room, and the first time she went in and Dad was there, you went in Restaurant by George, and the first person you saw was Natalie Wood. And you said, this is a nice place. And that's Mark Bass-Knight, and these are pictures of construction. Now we've got about 15 minutes left, and I have talked too much. And now the question becomes, based on your journey, what is your challenge to those who are inheriting the world you built? In any order you can conspire, collaborate.
Our challenge going forward certainly is to maintain this area with the flavor, the history, and everything that we enjoy about the Outer Banks. We have been through a lot, and I'm sure there are things that we've not anticipated that may come up in the future. But I am hopeful that we all working together can maintain the integrity of the Outer Banks for us all to enjoy and our children and grandchildren after us. And that is a big challenge.
I have one as well. I think collectively we have to do something to support 20 and 30-year-olds. It's getting to the point where they can't afford to live here. I think when I was growing up, my folks, I think, hoped that we would, their kids would go off and find their way outside of the Outer Banks. I don't think it's a hope anymore. I think it's just a necessity, and I don't know how it happens. But the challenge that I see for us is to make it so that young people can start and sustain careers on the Outer Banks.
That's our company's biggest challenge right now. Like many Outer Banks companies, we have really difficult time attracting people because of housing and cost of living. And we definitely need for the community to come together and figure out where some multifamily homes can be built, or something that is high density enough to bring the cost down for those young people and give them a place to live and work. And we need it across the board. We need it for teachers, we need it for firemen, we need it for policemen, we need it for the restaurant industry, and we need it for the retail industry. So it's across the board that we need it.
I totally agree with these folks that have just said the same thing. It's truly, ladies and gentlemen, it's an infrastructure issue for us right now, be it our businesses that are trying to work every day, be it our hospitals, our medical facilities, and being able to have folks that can afford to live here, and not just afford to live here, but have a life to raise their children and give them what they need to have. And I think the other thing, many of you all probably heard the story, which I love, because I do think the Outer Banks is a very welcoming place, not only to our visitors, but to all of us who move here and become neighbors together. But it was when Wilbur and Orville came across the first time, and the gentleman that met him said, "You have come among hospitable people." Yes. So I think we need to continue that. But this issue, and I see Mike Kelly standing over there as well, he knows that all of us in business in this room know this, all of us, that the housing issue is a huge issue that's affecting us. And quite frankly, ladies and gentlemen, we have been talking about that for years. We've got to get it worked out.
Teddy Roosevelt was elected president, I believe, in 1901, maybe 1901 to 1909. And to this day, he remains our only biologist president. He had a degree in biology. He was a recognized authority in birds. And he believed very strongly in conservation. And long story short, two of his things that he started were U.S. Fish and Wildlife and the United States Forest Service endure today. 1909, World War I, one of his cousins is elected president, Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt, in the height of the Great Depression, 1932, begins a wild and unprecedented impulse in America for conservation. The Cape Hatteras National Seashore began in 1932. Lots of local linkages to that. Swan Quarter National Wildlife Refuge, 1932. The Wright Brothers Monument, depending on how you measure it, 1932. And here we are as inheritors of what the Roosevelts have done, and then we fast forward beyond the time that the Roosevelts were here, and we fast forward to presidencies, and we arrive at 1986. And I submit to you, because we were America's first seashore, the word entrepreneur was built by some of the greatest entrepreneurs that our nation has ever produced, because they built something from nothing that is today a multi-billion-dollar annual tourism economy that has been created in the past 20 years. And in many ways, because they not only built businesses but built markets in the same way that Steve Jobs built people who wanted to have a phone that had one button, they did the same thing for the Outer Banks. So I submit to you, along America's seashore that they built, we've also produced some of the finest entrepreneurs in our country. And they sit here in front of us tonight, and we are eternally grateful for it. That's my conclusion. We have 5 minutes. You can say anything you want to include, is this true? Or we can tell some stories about some people in the room, too.
Very, very quickly, the purpose of tonight, really, other than getting together and having a great time, is to launch your book, Clark. You are the one that put it together, and we appreciate you doing that.
Now, I want to counter that briefly, and I don't want to get into a tussle with an accomplished attorney, but he walked in here and he's like, Clark, I have a list of your mistakes in the book, and there are many. That's a wonderful comment. That was a comment about all of Mark's children who supported him while he was in Raleigh, and we need to remember their names as well. Thank you. Tess or John, you had, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to mention that we're talking about things that we need to do for the community going forward. We need to continue to nurture tourism because it is a low impact, and our return on it is tremendous. It supports so many people in the community, and the people that aren't working in the tourism industry, you're receiving daily benefits through lower cost trash collection, lower cost, taxes, everything. So it's important. In the last couple of years, I've heard some anti-tourism sentiment, and it's really important to recognize how blessed we are to have this natural resource that tourists love. We need to continue to nurture tourism.
John, I couldn't agree with you more. And you know, when I have a friend here tonight from Wilmington, and she always talks about the beautiful bike paths that we have around here. And you know, all of that has come. I think when was the Visitors Bureau? You all started back in 1980. Was it that the Visitors Bureau kind of got off the ground and looked at, you know, how do we accommodate our visitors, but how do we also look at what's best for our people that are living here? All of that was planned. All of that was about thinking about everybody, which I think was, you know, pretty tremendous. But Clark, I want to thank you because you've done a tremendous job. No, you have. You can do the waving and all that kind of good stuff. Listen, I ride to Greenville to be in a meeting with this guy. I can tell you all about him, but when you go, be sure you take money. He never has any money. You have to buy him a biscuit at Bojangles, right? Yeah. But thank you because your passion, and your love for the Outer Banks and what you and your family have done for the Outer Banks has been phenomenal, and we're grateful to the Twitties.
Mom and Dad are right back there. Leave it to my parents to be in the very back row, but that's where they are back there.
Doug and Sharon, why don't you all stand up?
Chris, any final comments?
Just one thing. I got this from my conversation with Michael Stick, and when you mentioned you're among hospitable people, one of the things that he thought was super important about the Outer Banks is how accepting we are as a community. And he specifically mentioned George Crocker and Edward Green, who, you can imagine Edward coming here in the 50s or 60s as a dancer, a gay man in the South, and sort of talked about that. And Mike said, not just a gay man in the South, but both George and Eddie were openly gay with partners in a time when there was not that kind of acceptance nationwide. And I think when I was growing up and I made it over to Manteo High School, there was no racial animosity. Virginia Tillett was a true leader. I got to immediately be accepted by folks like her son, Michael Tillett. And, my grandparents were worried about me going from all-white Kitty Hawk into a racially diverse high school. And it's just amazing that we have that kind of acceptance in our community and have for such a long time.
Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to our conclusion. So now, let's go back to young Don Bryan, 19 years old, in a B-17. B-17s cruised about 18,000 feet. They were not pressurized. The average temperature in a B-17 was about 30 degrees below zero. 3 out of 4 chances he doesn't come home. And he went anyway. And tonight, I think he would be happy with the fact that we have all come together to honor what I submit to you are great builders. So with that, thank you all for coming. I want to again acknowledge the aquarium. There's no better venue in the state of North Carolina tonight. I want to thank the Don and Catherine Bryan Cultural Series. And I want to pass along my unending personal admiration for 3 people who I believe, live great lives. So will you join me in a round of applause and have a wonderful evening.